It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw the two girls standing on the porch, drenched from head to toe, their small hands clutching each other. They looked so lost, so fragile, as if the world had completely turned against them. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, and their lips quivered in the cold rain. The door in front of them had just been slammed shut by their grandmother, Mrs. Ebere, with a cold finality that echoed through the village. "Go back," she had screamed from inside. "Don't ever come here." I stood across the street, watching in disbelief. Mrs. Ebere wasn't known for kindness, but this was beyond cruel. Ada, the older of the two girls, was holding her little sister Nneka so tightly, as if she could somehow protect her from the cold, from the heartbreak, from everything. They had lost their parents just weeks ago. A car crash, everyone said. But there were whispers, hushed conversations in the corners of the market, murmurs about the accident not being so accidental after all. The girls, innocent as they were, didn't know the full story. They just knew their parents were gone and that their grandmother wanted nothing to do with them. It wasn't long before Auntie Ngozi, a neighbor, took them in. She had her own family to care for, but she couldn't stand the sight of those children standing in the rain, rejected by their only remaining blood relative. Her house was small, barely enough for her two kids, but she made room for Ada and Nneka. The girls were quiet, withdrawn. You could tell that the weight of their loss hung over them like a shadow. They didn't talk much, not even to each other. But the whispers about Mrs. Ebere never stopped. Everyone in the village knew she had always hated Chinedu, the girl's father. She thought Amoka, her daughter, had made the wrong choice by marrying him. She had wanted her daughter to marry someone with money, someone with status, but Amoka had followed her heart, choosing love over everything else. That choice had driven a deep wedge between mother and daughter, one that only seemed to grow with time. And then came the accident. Chinedu and Amoka had been driving back from a visit to the city when their car veered off the road and crashed into a tree. Both of them were killed instantly. But as the days went on, people began to talk about how the brakes had failed, about how someone had tampered with the car. The rumors were quiet at first, but they spread quickly. Some believed it was just a tragic accident, but others weren't so sure. They whispered about Mrs. Ebere, about how she had always made it clear she'd do anything to get Chinedu out of her daughter's life. No one wanted to believe it at first. How could a mother do something so awful, even if she despised the man her daughter had married? But the more you listened, the more it made sense. She had wanted Chinedu gone. What she didn't seem to care about, or maybe didn't expect, was that her daughter would be in the car with him that day. I remember hearing a group of women talking at the market. "She thought she could control everything," one of them whispered. "But she lost her daughter too. Now look at her." And indeed, Mrs. Ebere had become a ghost of herself. She never smiled, never greeted anyone. Her face, always stern, now seemed harder, like it had been carved from stone. People avoided her. They were too afraid to ask the questions that hung in the air, too afraid of the answers they might get. The girls, of course, had no idea. To them, their grandmother was just a cold, distant figure who had slammed the door on them when they needed her the most. They didn't know that the same woman who had turned them away might have had a hand in their parents' deaths. Ada and Nneka simply tried to survive each day, finding some comfort in Auntie Ngozi's small but warm home. One day, months after the accident, something strange happened. I was sweeping the front of my shop when I saw Mrs. Ebere walking toward Auntie Ngozi's house. She moved slowly, almost as if she was carrying a great weight on her back. I had never seen her like that before, so tired, so drained. She knocked on the door, and when Auntie Ngozi opened it, I could see the shock on her face. "I want to see them," Mrs. Ebere said, her voice quiet, almost pleading. Auntie Ngozi hesitated but eventually let her in. Inside, Ada and Nneka stood together, just like they had that day in the rain. They didn't rush to their grandmother, they didn't even move. They simply stared at her with eyes that had seen too much pain for children their age. "I made a mistake," Mrs. Ebere said, her voice cracking. "I want you to come home." Ada, always the more cautious of the two, didn't say a word. She just looked at her grandmother, and in that moment, I realized she knew. Maybe she didn't know all the details, but she knew enough. She knew that the woman standing in front of her wasn't just guilty of shutting them out. She was guilty of something far worse. "We're fine here," Ada finally said, her voice steady, her eyes hard. Mrs. Ebere blinked, as if the words had physically struck her. For the first time, I saw something like regret in her eyes, but it was too late. Whatever she had done, whatever reasons she had, it no longer mattered. The bond between her and her granddaughters had been broken beyond repair. She left quietly after that, walking back down the road with her shoulders slumped. I never saw her try to speak to them again. And over time, the whispers faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that some things, once broken, could never be fixed. Ada and Nneka stayed with Auntie Ngozi, and slowly, they began to heal. But they would never forget. The loss of their parents, the cruelty of their grandmother, and the weight of the unspoken truth would stay with them forever. And as for Mrs. Ebere, she became even more of a ghost in the village, living out her days alone, haunted by the consequences of her own choices. It was a year after the accident when everything changed. By then, the village had grown used to seeing Ada and Nneka living with Auntie Ngozi. They had settled into their new lives, as much as children could after losing their parents. The whispers about Mrs. Ebere had quieted down, though no one had forgotten what they believed. People moved on, or at least pretended to. Life in the village had a way of moving forward, no matter how heavy the past might weigh. But then, one afternoon, something happened that no one expected. It was the village's annual market day, a day when everyone gathered in the center to buy and sell, catch up on news, and enjoy a brief break from the usual routine. The market was busy, bustling with the sound of people haggling over prices, children running around, and the general hum of life. I was at my store, selling yams, when I noticed her, Mrs. Ebere, walking slowly through the crowd. At first, I thought nothing of it. She had become something of a shadow in the village, rarely seen, always keeping to herself. But there was something different about her that day. She wasn't just walking, she was heading toward the center of the market with a purpose. Her face looked even more worn than usual, her eyes distant but determined. She was carrying a small stool, and when she reached the middle of the crowd, she set it down and climbed on top of it. At first, no one paid her much attention. But then she started speaking. "I have something to say," she called out, her voice loud enough to cut through the noise. The chatter around her gradually died down, and people turned to look. She was standing there, tall and rigid as always, but there was something different in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear. Or maybe it was guilt. "I know what you all think of me," she began. "I know what you've been saying behind my back. And I'm not here to deny it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged confused glances. No one had ever expected her to acknowledge the rumors, let alone speak about them so openly. "I hated Chinedu," she said bluntly, her voice shaking slightly. "I never wanted him for my daughter. I thought he was beneath her, that he couldn't give her the life she deserved. I tried to stop their marriage, but she didn't listen to me. She chose him over me." Her words were harsh, but there was something breaking beneath them. The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone hanging on her every word. "When they got married, I swore I'd make him pay. I thought he ruined her life. I thought he was the reason she turned away from me, and I couldn't stand it." She paused for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "I tampered with their car." A collective gasp went through the crowd. I felt the blood drain from my face as her words sank in. The rumors had always been there, but hearing her admit it out loud was something else entirely. "I didn't know Amoka would be with him that day," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I only wanted to get rid of Chinedu, to free her from him. But I didn't think," her voice broke, and for the first time in my life I saw Mrs. Ebere's eyes fill with tears. "I didn't think it would take her too." The silence in the market was heavy, suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Mrs. Ebere stood there, trembling on the stool, the weight of her confession pulling her down. "I killed my own daughter," she said, her voice barely audible now. "I killed her because I couldn't let go of my pride, because I thought I knew what was best for her. And now I have nothing." She stepped down from the stool, her legs unsteady. The crowd remained frozen, shocked into silence by the gravity of her words. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to react. For a moment, she just stood there, looking around at the faces of the people she had lived among her whole life. There was no anger in her expression anymore, no bitterness. Just a deep, crushing sadness. "I can't ask for forgiveness," she said quietly. "Not from you, and certainly not from Ada and Nneka. But I wanted you all to know the truth. I wanted you to hear it from me." With that, she walked away, her steps slow and heavy, disappearing down the road toward her house. The market remained eerily quiet long after she left, as if the entire village was holding its breath. In the days that followed, the news of her confession spread like wildfire. Some people were horrified. Others said they had always known something wasn't right about the accident. But the most heartbreaking reaction came from Ada and Nneka. When they heard the truth, they didn't cry. They didn't shout. They simply stared at each other, as if the last piece of their shattered world had finally fallen into place. Mrs. Ebere became a complete recluse after that day. She no longer ventured into the village, no longer attended church or market days. Some said they saw her sitting on her porch, staring out at nothing, her face hollow and distant. She had confessed, but it hadn't brought her peace. It hadn't undone what she had done. As for Ada and Nneka, they remained with Auntie Ngozi, and though they grew older and stronger, the scars of that day, and everything that followed, stayed with them. They had lost their parents in the worst possible way, and the truth of their grandmother's role in it had only deepened their wounds. The village moved on, as it always did. But no one forgot. The memory of Mrs. Ebere's confession lingered like a shadow, a reminder that sometimes the most painful truths are the ones we keep hidden, even from ourselves.